The solitude in Silver Creek, a cluster of 4 houses and a dusty general store, was a heavy thing, dense as the old pine beams supporting Tom Randall's rambling cabin. Tom was 40 years old, and half of that time he had spent right here smelling the same things. The sharp tang of pitch from the logs split last winter, the deep, greasy scent of stale coffee, and underneath it all, the sweet, pervasive musk of old wood smoke that had settled into the very grain of the floorboards. It was a predictable kind of loneliness, a kind one could rely on after the sudden silence that follows the elimination of a family. The only thing that kept the world anchored for Tom was Cotti. Cotti wasn't a breed so much as an act of nature, a giant black wolfhound mix that weighed a solid 140 pounds. He looked less like a dog and more like a cinder block wrapped in shaggy, coal-colored fur. Cotti was the house's heartbeat, heavy and reliable. His snores often rattled the window panes when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. He was the brute force of nature that Tom could still touch and trust. Tom's land ended abruptly where the forest began. It wasn't a gradual transition. It was a sudden, dark wall of spruce and lodgepole pine. Beyond that line, the Montana wilderness was truly untamed, stretching for hundreds of miles. Lately, though, the air just past the back fence had taken on an unsettling, viscous quality. It felt thick and immobile, like breathing through a wet burlap sack. Tom found himself waking almost every night around 2 o'clock in the morning. His dreams were often disturbed, not by nightmares, but by the absence of familiar sounds. What replaced them was worse. A sound deep in the woods that wasn't a howl, wasn't the bark of a coyote, and definitely wasn't the grunt of a black bear. It was a low, guttural moan, a grinding sound that reverberated more in the chest than the ear. It sounded like something attempting to exhale a profound curse, something non-human struggling to release a monumental weight of despair and rage. Cotti, usually the embodiment of clumsy noise, his tail thumping against the wall, his massive paws scraping the wooden floor, his panting like a struggling steam engine, had changed. The transformation was insidious, subtle enough that Tom dismissed it as his own growing paranoia until the evidence stood right there, pacing the periphery of his sight. Cotti stopped making noise. His movements, once earth-shaking, were now silent. He stalked across the old, creaking pine floor of the living room. Even the loose board near the hearth that always sang a high-pitched protest when stepped on, without a single whisper of sound. Tom tested it once, dropping a piece of deer jerky 10 feet away. Cotti moved, and the only indication of his passage was the sudden absence of the jerky. It was unnerving, like living with a ghost that ate table scraps. His eyes, too, had been affected. They used to be a dull, comforting hazel brown, soft with unconditional affection, and an occasional glimmer of mischief when he contemplated stealing a sock. Now they were rigid, unblinking discs of amber. Not yellow, but the hard, dense color of fossilized tree sap, containing an ancient, frozen anxiety. When Cotti looked at Tom, he did not look at him, but through him, focusing on some terrible geometry waiting just outside the circle of lamplight. The tipping point came on a night so dark, the blackness felt sticky to the touch. The moon was absent, hidden behind an impenetrable blanket of storm clouds that promised rain yet remained dry. Tom had been reading in the kitchen, the single 60-watt bulb buzzing faintly above him, when the forest erupted. It wasn't the guttural moan this time. It was a single, piercing, wild shriek. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but the sheer agonizing intensity of the sound made Tom's teeth ache. It wasn't the sound of an animal being hunted. It was the sound of something being fundamentally undone. Then an enormous silence fell, a silence that was louder and more oppressive than the scream had been. Tom jumped up, grabbing the old hunting rifle leaning against the counter. He shouted Cotti's name. No thumping tail, no massive body lumbering to the door. Cotti was gone. Tom knew his dog never wandered, especially not into the forest at night. He ran to the back door, scanning the yard with the weak beam of a cheap flashlight. Nothing. Just the dew-covered grass and the wall of black trees. He spent the next 3 hours agonizing, listening to the suffocating quiet, convinced the woods had simply swallowed his only companion. The silence grew heavier until the air felt pressurized. Cotti returned just as the first gray fingers of dawn were reaching over the mountains, pushing the night back a few miles at a time. A thick, clammy fog lay low over the yard, clinging to the spruce branches like damp cotton. Cotti appeared from the dense undergrowth near the old, collapsed shed. He did not trot or even walk. He simply materialized, his massive form seeming to coalesce out of the mist. His thick black coat was matted and stiff. It was covered in dried, almost black blood concentrated around his shoulders and flanks. The blood didn't smell like iron. It smelled coppery and rank, like something metallic mixed with fresh manure and fear. But Tom's heart slammed against his ribs when he ran a frantic hand over Cotti's body. There was not a single injury, not a scratch, not a tear in the dense, oily fur. The blood belonged to something else entirely. Cotti stood there, his breath shallow. His tongue, usually slick and pink, was pale, almost white, and dry as bone. He stood frozen, waiting for judgment, his amber eyes locked not on Tom, but on the shifting edges of the receding fog. It was the posture of a warrior returning from a difficult battle demanding distance. Tom tried to gently wipe the foul residue from Cotti's back with a flannel towel, but Cotti pulled away violently, a low, warning rumble finally escaping his chest. It wasn't a threat, but a tortured plea for isolation. He would not be touched. That night, Cotti did not sleep at all. He abandoned his accustomed bed by the wood stove. Instead, he took up position by the large picture window facing the east woods. He sat rigid, his snout pressed against the cool glass, breath fogging the pain in tiny, desperate puffs. He did not watch like an animal expecting a deer or a rabbit. He watched with the terrible patience of a guard awaiting the shifting of a clock, waiting for the moon to pierce the canopy. It was an expectation, not a hunt. Tom knew then, as he lay rigid in his own bed, listening to the heavy, methodical breathing of his dog. The familiar world had cracked, and something was crawling through the fissures. The morning after Cotti's bloody return arrived with a suffocating blue clarity, the kind of summer day in Montana where the heat is dry and the horizon seems impossibly close. The radio, normally useless for anything beyond farming reports and static, crackled with real news. 10 miles west, near the Blackfoot Reservation border, a prize stallion had been eliminated from a ranch. Not stolen, not scared off. Just gone. The newsreader, his voice attempting a steady calm, mentioned only that the paddock showed evidence of significant disruption. Tom knew what that meant. He drove his beat-up Ford into the small service town, the one everyone just called the Junction, to buy feed and snag a conversation with someone who wasn't trying to sell him insulation. The air in town was charged with an unpleasant energy. Faces, usually weathered and placid, were now tight, etched with a barely contained nervousness. The dogs were the first sign. The usually cacophonous community of hounds and mutts were silent. They were not barking at Tom's truck. They were not running the perimeter of the hardware store. They were locked in yards or, more often, had retreated inside the houses, their shadows visible through closed screen doors, rigid and unmoving. The town's feral cats, notorious for their brazen sunbathing on Main Street, were completely absent. The atmosphere was thick, clotting like August haze before a thunderstorm. He saw Sheriff Wade by the feed store. Wade was a man whose body seemed entirely composed of worn denim and old leather. A man who had seen everything the Montana wilderness could throw at people. Wade looked tired. "Morning, Randall," the sheriff grunted, running a calloused hand over his clean-shaven scalp. Tom asked about the stallion. Wade just shrugged, chewing slowly on a piece of tobacco he hadn't fully committed to spitting out. Grizzly, or a rogue pack of wolves bigger than usual, getting desperate this time of year. He tried to keep his voice level, but a tremor laced his dismissal. "We found tracks, Tom. Biggest I ever saw. But they aren't right." Wade's eyes flickered away, looking toward the distant blue line of the mountains. "How so, Wade?" "Too clean. For a brute wolf, they're too neat. Wide pads, massive. But the toes? They look almost articulated. Like fingers, almost. We are telling folks it's an overgrown wild dog. You tell them that, too." Tom bought the feed, but he also walked across the street to the electronics store, the only place in a 50-mile radius that carried anything remotely high-tech. He spent $300 on 3 compact trail cameras equipped with high-sensitivity motion sensors and infrared night vision. He told the clerk he was trying to catch the deer that kept eating his vegetable garden, a lie that tasted like burnt sugar on his tongue. He was not after venison. He was chasing certainty. He needed a reason, a rational biological explanation for the blood on Cotti's coat and the cold dread in Wade's eyes. He needed logic, not myth. Back home, the light was failing, spreading a long, sickly yellow over the property. He worked methodically, sinking the cameras into the ground around the perimeter, concealing them deep within the thick, thorny thickets of wild rose bushes and behind large clusters of chokecherry shrubs. The lens faced the clearing, and the clearing faced the black forest. The first 2 nights brought only mundane observations. Camera 1 recorded a jittery bobcat hunting mice. Camera 2 caught a massive mule deer grazing for 45 minutes, completely oblivious. Camera 3, the one pointed directly at the main tree line, only recorded the shifting of the fog and the relentless, indifferent stars. Tom went to bed restless but slightly relieved. Wade was right. It was just a big dog, and the weird sounds were just a trick of the wind. But on the 3rd night, the atmosphere shifted. The moon rose not directly overhead, but low in the east, bathing the clearing in a stark, unnaturally bright yellow light, turning the world into an old, sepia-toned photograph. At 3:17 a.m., the sound came back. The low, grinding moan, closer this time, almost behind the shed. Tom shot out of bed, grabbed the playback reader for the cameras, and raced down the rickety wooden steps into the cold, damp silence of the basement, where he had hooked up a small monitor. His heart hammered a furious rhythm against his ribs. He punched up the feed for camera 3, the one focused on the deepest part of the woodline. The recording started normally. The yellow moonlight, the still trees. But then, as a shadow began to detach itself from the dense trunks, the image began to degrade. A wave of white noise, static, like television snow, rushed across the screen, making the picture shake violently, filling the corners with chaotic, unreadable energy. The sound was also corrupted. It wasn't the moan anymore. It was a high-pitched mechanical whine, a noise that sounded like thin metal being brutally stretched and torn, layered over a deep, subsonic hum that Tom felt in his teeth. He fast-forwarded through several minutes of this visual agony, pausing only when the camera briefly, violently, stabilized. There was one frame, a single, short, clear flash of digital clarity before the static swallowed it whole again. The silhouette was tall, unnaturally so, maybe 6.5 feet, gangly and clumsy but moving with a terrible preternatural speed. It was definitely bipedal, walking awkwardly on its hind legs, its profile suggesting massive shoulders and a strangely flattened head. Tom felt a cold wash of nausea, the room spinning slightly. But the true horror wasn't the creature itself. It was the sight right in front of the creature. There stood Cotti, Tom's massive, beautiful black dog. Cotti was walking directly ahead of the towering silhouette, moving slowly, deliberately, not looking back, but clearly leading the thing out of the woods and into the open. His tail, that enormous rudder of black fur, was held perfectly motionless. He was not running from the monster. He was escorting it. He was a silent black herald. Tom sat back hard against the concrete wall, the smell of damp earth and mold suddenly overwhelming. The digital certainty of the camera had destroyed the comforting lie of the stray wolf. Cotti was not a victim. He was a collaborator. "Morning, Randall," the sheriff grunted, running a calloused hand over his clean-shaven scalp. Tom asked about the stallion. Wade just shrugged, chewing slowly on a piece of tobacco he hadn't fully committed to spitting out. Grizzly, or a rogue pack of wolves bigger than usual. Getting desperate this time of year. He tried to keep his voice level, but a tremor laced his dismissal. "We found tracks, Tom. Biggest I ever saw. But they aren't right." Wade's eyes flickered away, looking toward the distant blue line of the mountains. "How so, Wade?" "Too clean. For a brute wolf, they're too neat. Wide pads, massive. But the toes, they look almost articulated. Like fingers, almost. We are telling folks it's an overgrown wild dog. You tell them that, too." Tom bought the feed, but he also walked across the street to the electronics store, the only place in a 50-mile radius that carried anything remotely high-tech. He spent $300 on 3 compact trail cameras equipped with high-sensitivity motion sensors and infrared night vision. He told the clerk he was trying to catch the deer that kept eating his vegetable garden, a lie that tasted like burnt sugar on his tongue. He was not after venison. He was chasing certainty. He needed a reason, a rational biological explanation for the blood on Cotti's coat and the cold dread in Wade's eyes. He needed logic, not myth. Back home, the light was failing, spreading a long, sickly yellow over the property. He worked methodically, sinking the cameras into the ground around the perimeter, concealing them deep within the thick, thorny thickets of wild rose bushes and behind large clusters of chokecherry shrubs. The lens faced the clearing, and the clearing faced the black forest. The first 2 nights brought only mundane observations. Camera 1 recorded a jittery bobcat hunting mice. Camera 2 caught a massive mule deer grazing for 45 minutes, completely oblivious. Camera 3, the one pointed directly at the main tree line, only recorded the shifting of the fog and the relentless, indifferent stars. Tom went to bed restless, but slightly relieved. Wade was right. It was just a big dog, and the weird sounds were just a trick of the wind. But on the third night, the atmosphere shifted. The moon rose not directly overhead, but low in the east, bathing the clearing in a stark, unnaturally bright yellow light, turning the world into an old, sepia-toned photograph. At 3:17 a.m., the sound came back, the low, grinding moan, closer this time, almost behind the shed. Tom shot out of bed, grabbed the playback reader for the cameras, and raced down the rickety wooden steps into the cold, damp silence of the basement where he had hooked up a small monitor. His heart hammered a furious rhythm against his ribs. He punched up the feed for camera 3, the one focused on the deepest part of the wood line. The recording started normally. The yellow moonlight, the still trees. But then, as a shadow began to detach itself from the dense trunks, the image began to degrade. A wave of white noise, static like television snow, rushed across the screen, making the picture shake violently, filling the corners with chaotic, unreadable energy. The sound was also corrupted. It wasn't the moan anymore. It was a high-pitched mechanical whine, a noise that sounded like thin metal being brutally stretched and torn, layered over a deep subsonic hum that Tom felt in his teeth. He fast-forwarded through several minutes of this visual agony, pausing only when the camera briefly, violently stabilized. There was one frame, a single short, clear flash of digital clarity before the static swallowed it whole again. The silhouette was tall, unnaturally so, maybe 6.5 feet, gangly and clumsy, but moving with a terrible, preternatural speed. It was definitely bipedal, walking awkwardly on its hind legs, its profile suggesting massive shoulders and a strangely flattened head. Tom felt a cold wash of nausea, the room spinning slightly. But the true horror wasn't the creature itself. It was the sight right in front of the creature. There stood Cotti, Tom's massive, beautiful black dog. Cotti was walking directly ahead of the towering silhouette, moving slowly, deliberately, not looking back, but clearly leading the thing out of the woods and into the open. His tail, that enormous rudder of black fur, was held perfectly motionless. He was not running from the monster. He was escorting it. He was a silent, black herald. Tom sat back hard against the concrete wall, the smell of damp earth and mold suddenly overwhelming. The digital certainty of the camera had destroyed the comforting lie of the stray wolf. Cotti was not a victim. He was a collaborator. The image on the playback, Cotti leading the tall, awkward shadow, lodged in Tom's mind like a sliver of ice. The connection between his dog and the rising tide of local horror was undeniable, a mathematical certainty. Yet Tom could not bridge the gap. He saw the evidence, but he refused to accept that the giant, loyal black presence in his life, the dog who used to sleep with his head resting on Tom's feet, was capable of guiding destruction. He was simply Cotti, his companion, not a vanguard for some primal monstrosity. Denial took the shape of a new routine. Cotti was locked in the old lumber barn every night. The barn was built from dense, old-growth oak, secured with a heavy steel crossbar and a thick brass padlock. It felt like a fortress, a tangible barrier against the collapse of Tom's reality. The confinement lasted only 2 nights. On the morning of the 3rd day, Tom approached the barn with a nervous reverence, bringing Cotti's water bowl. The door was still latched, the padlock unbroken, But the wood around the lock, 4 solid inches of ancient oak, was mangled. Not clawed, but torn. There were deep, long furrows, raw wood, visible beneath the scratched and splintered varnish, as if something had tried to pry the boards apart with enormous, desperate bare hands. They were ragged, uneven trenches of destruction, too forceful for claws, too defined for a shoulder ram. Cotti, when released, looked utterly depleted. His amber eyes held a flat, miserable exhaustion. He refused the beef jerky Tom offered, turning his snout away from the bowl of kibble. He drank, though. He drank the entire bucket of water greedily, gulping it down until he started to gag. When he exhaled, the air that rushed past Tom's face was hot and foul. It was not dog breath. It smelled like oxidized metal, a sharp, coppery stench mixed with the heavy, chemical tang of ozone. It was the same smell Tom remembered from 40 years ago, when he had stumbled upon a deer carcass in the woods, stripped down to bone and sinew, the scene reeking of a violence that defied nature. That night, the silence shattered. It wasn't the low, infrastructural moan. It was a scream, a short, terrible burst of sound that was unmistakably human. It ended abruptly, cut off not by distance but by an absolute finality. An hour later, there was a frantic, desperate pounding on Tom's front door. It was the nearest neighbor, a man named Sal, usually loud and booming, now reduced to a whimpering, terrified husk. He's gone, Tom. Buddy's gone. Sal's prize hound was his life. His hands were shaking so violently Tom could hear his wedding ring rattling against the glass pane. I heard him cry, just a short sound, not a fight. And then, nothing. Sal backed away, his eyes wide and unfocused. I saw something, Tom, at the edge of the trees. It was big, too big, and it was just watching me, standing up like a man, but black, like a shadow with teeth. Sal did not ask for help. He just needed to voice his terror before retreating into the doubtful safety of his own home. Tom felt the cold, familiar grip of inevitability. He could not just stand there, paralyzed by fear and confusion. He grabbed the heavy bolt-action hunting rifle, checked the magazine, and strapped a powerful, long-beam lantern to his belt. He had to go to the place where Cotti had been disappearing, the place where the silence bred violence. The forest was immediately hostile. The cold was a damp, clinging presence, and the air was saturated with the smell of wet earth and ancient decay. Under his boots, the ground squelched softly, rotting leaves and a strange, brittle crunch that Tom instantly recognized as fine, shattered bone. He walked half a mile, following the faint, disturbed earth where Cotti's heavy paws had churned the soil, until he reached a small, hidden clearing. This was the scene of the action. The earth was pulverized, churned into a dark mud, as if a small bomb of pure animal fury had detonated here. There were deep gouges in the ground, some 3 feet long, as if something enormous had been dragged violently across the clearing. Tom shone the lantern over the nearest old maple tree. Embedded in the scarred bark, clinging to a rough patch of fissure, were strands of hair. They were black, thick, and coarse, like wire pulled from a tire. Not animal hair, Tom realized with a spike of alarm. Too thick, too stiff. Then he saw it. Scattered near the root ball of the maple were small fragments of something synthetic, a cheap, worn material, slightly stained with a dried brownish substance. A scrap of a flannel shirt. Human clothing. The horrible realization settled over Tom like a shroud. Sal's dog had not been the only victim in the night's carnage. Just as the nausea reached his throat, the air behind him shifted. Not a sound, just a displacement of pressure. A sound of heavy, choked, intermittent breathing, close enough to feel the air move. Tom slowly, meticulously turned around, holding the rifle low but ready. Cotti stood there. But it wasn't Cotti. The massive dog was now impossibly tall. He stood on two legs, his spine curved unnaturally forward, giving him a towering, hunched stature. The skin of his neck and shoulders was stretched tight, defining powerful, rigid muscles Tom had never known he possessed. His snout was shorter, thicker, the teeth too large and too numerous. And his eyes. The amber was gone. They were pure, unadulterated fire, burning with a savage, intelligent intensity. It was the look of a pure predator, stripped of all domesticity. This was not his dog. This was a monster, wrapped tightly in the black, familiar fur of his beloved companion. A Dogman. A thing from ancient nightmares made real on a wet Montana evening. The creature that had been Cotti did not immediately move. It stood there, a grotesque, towering parody of its former self, its massive frame trembling slightly. The guttural sound Tom had heard from the woods now issued from its throat. A low, thick gurgle, something that suggested a desperate attempt at communication, a sound caught halfway between a roar and a word. Tom saw the wound. Running horizontally across the creature's massive, stretched neck, where the leather collar usually sat, were deep, jagged, but already healing scars, not inflicted by the barn door, but by the trauma that initiated this terrible change. Tom slowly lowered the rifle, the heavy metal cold and useless in his hands. He was not looking at a beast, but at a captive wearing a monstrous disguise. For a fleeting second, the terrifying, burning amber eyes held a spark of recognition. A human intelligence grappling with animalistic terror and loss. It was the briefest moment of contact, a microsecond of shared horror, before the weight of instinct slammed down, eclipsing the last vestiges of Tom's companion. The creature backed away smoothly, turning with a terrible, silent grace that belied its bulk. It did not run. It simply merged with the layered shadows, disappearing into the dark complexity of the forest as if dissolving into the very air. Tom stood alone, the memory of that flicker of human despair in the creature's eyes more paralyzing than any direct attack could have been. It was like seeing the ghost of his dead son, fleeting and horrific, yet strangely compelling. The attacks escalated rapidly. The next day, the county sheriff's office was overwhelmed. Reports streamed in from ranches and remote hunting cabins. 3 missing persons, deer hunters who did not survive the night, were found near the river fork. The grim detail in the reports was consistent. The bodies were utterly destroyed, ripped apart with methodical savagery. But none of the remains had been consumed. This was not the desperate hunt of a starving predator. It was something else entirely. It was violence for the sake of asserting dominance, a ritualistic, brutal statement. Panic descended upon the towns near the forest line like a thick, foul blanket. People started barricading their windows and arming themselves. But Tom knew the truth. A shotgun blast, no matter how potent, was futile against the speed, the uncanny strength, and the sheer focused terror of these things. A war had been declared, and it was being waged by rules that bypassed human understanding. Tom spent the next 24 hours in a frantic, desperate search for explanation, poring over dusty books and clicking through archaic online forums using the slow, sputtering dial-up connection. He looked up ancient European legends, Native American lore, anything that referenced dogmen or bipedal canids. He eventually found a brittle newspaper clipping from a university database, dating back nearly 40 years, detailing a series of strange, unrevealed tragedies in this specific region of the state. The description of the victims was clinical and chilling. Eliminated by extraordinary force, remains entirely fragmented, the specific detail of deep, tearing wounds inconsistent with known fauna. The consensus at the time was mass hysteria combined with exceptionally large predators. Tom knew better. This was not just cyclical violence, it was a reawakening. Tom looked at Cotti's empty dog bed. He understood that his home was now merely an outpost, a familiar stage for something alien and predatory. Staying meant waiting for the inevitable. The time for logic was over. The time for survival was now. He packed with a cold, almost detached precision. Cans of beans, water purification tablets, 5 boxes of rifle ammunition, a thermal blanket, and a heavy wool coat. He checked the gas tank of the F-150. Full. He had to go south, away from the impenetrable mountains, toward the flatter, more populated areas, before the military or the National Guard woke up and closed the highways. Flight was the only rational human response left. He glanced one last time at the darkening woods, feeling the invisible weight of the amber gaze pressing against the window pane. The old life was over. He started the truck, the engine kicking over with a noisy protest that sounded deafening in the heavy twilight, and drove toward the paved county road, leaving the ghost of his life behind, hoping the monster wearing his dog's skin would allow him this final act of retreat. The bid for freedom lasted precisely 22 miles. The highway, County Route 12, was usually deserted at night, stretching like a black ribbon across the dry prairie grass before winding into the foothills. Tonight, it was a graveyard. He came around a wide curve and slammed on the brakes, the F-150's tires squealing against the asphalt. The road was impassable. A massive spruce, fully 70 feet long, had been shoved across the lanes, its roots torn from the earth like wet sponges. Beyond it, a gas tanker truck lay on its side, the air thick with the sharp, sickening smell of spilled diesel and an unsettling metallic tang. Tom killed the engine and sat in the sudden, heavy silence. The silence felt deliberately arranged. He got out of the truck, the ground crunching under his boots. He walked slowly toward the wreckage, holding the rifle ready. The tree had not fallen in a storm, it looked pushed. The roots were ripped out, not snapped, and in the thin layer of dust on the blacktop Tom saw them. Tracks, not tires. They were wide, sliding impressions, massive pads leaving smears rather than distinct prints. Bipedal, but dragging heavily on the asphalt. He could not stay here. The smell of fuel was too dangerous, the obstruction too clearly intended to halt passage. He grabbed his pack and set off on foot, keeping to the drainage ditch beside the road. He moved slowly, adrenaline giving him a false sense of stealth. The feeling of being watched was immediate and oppressive. It was not a sense of lurking danger. It was the steady, heavy presence of surveillance. Every time he stopped, he scanned the dense rows of juniper and fir trees flanking the road, but saw nothing, only the thick, unmoving blackness of the Montana night. Yet he knew the eyes were out there, tracking his every move. After walking for maybe 1 mile, he found an anomaly. An old, derelict motel complex set back from the main road. It had served travelers 40 years ago before the new interstate had been built 10 miles east. The sign, "The Pines Rest," was faded, the letters chipped and illegible in the dark. The windows were either broken or tightly boarded up with salvaged plywood. It was perfect. Abandoned, easily defended, and smelling only of dust, dampness, and the metallic sweetness of decay. He found the office door unlocked, squeaking open onto a corridor lined with 7 dark rooms. He chose the third door down, kicking it open. The interior was choked with dust and the stale, chemical odor of old carpet and dried paint. And then he heard the sound, a quick, sharp inhalation of breath from the corner of the room. He leveled the rifle, safety off. "Who's there?" "Talk, or I fire." A small voice, brittle with terror but surprisingly steady, answered from behind a stack of mildewed mattresses. "Don't shoot. I'm not armed. I'm alone." She crawled out from the shadows. She was young, maybe early 20s, dressed in practical dirty jeans and a heavy work jacket. Her hair was pulled back tight, her eyes wide and dark with shock. "My name is Claire," she whispered, standing up slowly. "I was in Brooks Falls. It's gone. Just disappeared." Brooks Falls was a logging town 30 miles northwest. Claire was the sole survivor of whatever had befallen her community. Her composure, despite her obvious trauma, was the only thing holding her together. They exchanged quick, urgent words. The blocked road, the silent atmosphere, the sheer speed of the surrounding calamity. The night settled, bringing with it a profound, thundering sense of noise from outside. The gravel lot surrounding the motel was vast, loose stone crunching under enormous pressure. They heard the heavy, rhythmic steps. The sound was uneven, unsettlingly complex. Sometimes 4 massive impacts, sometimes 2, followed by a heavy, slithering drag. It was the sound of something in transition, something struggling between 4 legs and 2. The creatures, Tom knew there were multiple now, began to circle the building. They were not aggressive, not yet. They moved slowly, methodically, occasionally striking the wooden walls with heavy, dull thuds as if testing the material, or maybe just listening to the terror trapped inside. They were patient. Huddled in the darkness, the windows taped up with yellowed newspaper, Claire started to cry, her fear finally overwhelming her. "I saw their leader," she choked out, wiping her eyes with the cuff of her jacket. It was the biggest, black, like a hole in the light. "It took my neighbor, Frank. Tore him to pieces right in his yard." She shuddered violently. But before it went for Frank, it looked at me. Right at me. Its eyes, that awful amber fire. She paused, struggling for air. It didn't end me, Tom. It stood 6 feet away and just stared. Then it raised a massive clawed hand. It was a gesture. Like a man, Tom. A deliberate, controlled gesture that meant, "You are spared." She looked at Tom, tears streaking the dust on her cheeks. "It was your dog. I'm sure of it. That black fur. Those eyes. Your dog is the one running this. He's the alpha." Tom felt the floor tilt beneath him. Cotti wasn't just infected. He was a commander. The gentle giant, his faithful companion, had inherited an unspeakable kingdom and had just granted Claire, by an act of terrible, calculating will, the right to live. The relentless siege ended with the dawn. The light crept in grudgingly, filtering through the newspaper-covered windows, painting the dust motes in the stagnant air a pale, sickly yellow. Tom and Claire waited until the rising sun, now 20 degrees above the eastern horizon, had burned off the last traces of morning mist before venturing out. The gravel lot was scarred by deep, wide impressions where the creatures had paced, but the heavy scent of ozone and metal had dissipated, replaced by the mundane smell of wet asphalt and pine needles. The relief was only momentary. Their nerves were brittle, stretched thin by the long night of surveillance. Tom came to a decision with cold, clear clarity. Running was futile. If Cotti was the leader, the alpha, then every route out of the territory was watched, blocked, and patrolled. Cotti was not just hunting for food. He was asserting boundaries, maintaining a terrifying, new jurisdiction. The only way to stop the carnage, the only way to claw back any semblance of peace, was to confront the source. Tom felt a crushing weight of culpability. He had not protected his dog, and now that failure had manifested as a dictator of a bloody pack. He had to go back into the forest not for escape, but for understanding, and for an end. To his surprise, Claire insisted on coming with him. Her fear was palpable, a constant tension in her movements, but her resolve was stronger. "He let me live," she repeated, her voice low and firm. "There is a reason. Maybe he chose me, or maybe I'm just an accidental piece on his chessboard. I need to know why I survived Brooks Falls. We are both part of his hierarchy now, whether we want it or not." They left the motel and walked back along the highway, reclaiming the F-150 and driving the remaining distance in silence. Tom's house looked violated. The back door hung half off its hinges, the oak frame splintered. The interior was ransacked, but not in the chaotic way of human thieves. Furniture was overturned, cushions slashed, and the walls were scored with deep, rhythmic furrows, a signature of powerful, non-random aggression. But in the living room, Tom stopped dead. The mantelpiece was untouched. Standing there, slightly dusty but perfectly upright, was a small, framed photo album containing the only remaining images of his wife and son. It was surrounded by broken vases and scattered debris, yet it had not been moved, much less damaged. A message, Tom realized, chilling him to the core. A conscious choice not to destroy the last relic of Tom's former life. A gesture of terrible, monstrous memory. He noted something else unsettling. The typical metallic stench of the attack sites was weak here. The dominant smells were earthy, heavy with animal sweat, and the specific musky scent of dog, not decay, but life. This house, Tom understood, had not been a killing ground. It had been a residence. Cotti, the Dogman Alpha, had occupied his old territory. Equipped with the rifle, the ammunition, and a sense of resigned duty, they turned and walked toward the tree line, back into the abyss where the trail camera had captured the unspeakable footage. The moment they crossed the property line, the landscape of their terror became a language. The creatures had not simply walked through the woods, they had marked it. Tom and Claire began noticing markers. Thick branches snapped off at shoulder height, lying on the ground pointing inward. Dense clumps of black wire-like fur snagged on the barbs of wild raspberry bushes. Piles of stones arranged deliberately beneath ancient pines. These were not accidental spoor. These were directives. "They're guiding us," Claire whispered, her voice strained. "Like trail signs. They want us to find them. He wants us to come to him." The markers led them deeper into the shadows, toward the heart of the Dogman's domain, and toward the inescapable confrontation with the monster who wore Tom's love like a hideous mask. The deeper Tom and Claire ventured, the more profoundly the forest structure changed. It was like walking into a different ecosystem, less a natural woodland and more a carefully tended primitive architecture. The trees were massive, 100-foot spruces with trunks thicker than oil drums, and curiously, there was no undergrowth. No tangled briars, no low-lying shrubs, just clean, dark earth beneath the towering canopy. It felt less like a wild forest and more like a hushed, ancient cathedral built of timber and shadow. The silence was the most oppressive element. It was absolute, crushing. They walked for nearly 2 hours without hearing the chirp of a bird, the buzzing of an insect, or the rustle of a squirrel. Even the wind passed above the canopy, leaving the lower levels entirely stagnant. The animals, sensing the unnatural dominion established here, had fled miles away. The profound stillness pressed against Tom's eardrums, creating an unnerving high-pitched whine that was entirely internal. They followed a wide trail, clearly created by repeated heavy passage. It was too wide for deer, too distinct for a regular game path. Along the edges of this path, Tom began to see objects that were utterly foreign to the natural environment. A sliver of brightly colored melting plastic. A piece of chrome-plated metal scored and bent by impossible pressure. A section of degraded synthetic cable. These were not remnants of casual human presence. They hinted at technological interference, some kind of abandoned structure or experiment that had catalyzed this horror. Claire was the first to notice the symbols. Etched into the bark of several large firs were sets of marks. They were not claw marks. They were specific, precise carvings. 3 short horizontal lines, deeply scored, followed by 1 long vertical line. The pattern repeated every 20 feet or so, always at the same height, roughly 5 feet from the ground. "It's writing," Claire murmured, running her finger over the rough bark. Primitive, but it's communication. They're marking their territory, their history, or maybe just their numbers. Tom felt the familiar pressure behind his eyes, the urge to intellectualize the terror, to reduce it to a solvable problem. But the effort failed. He could no longer think of the creature as Cotti, the dog, or even the Dogman. The being they were following had agency. It was making choices based on necessity, power, and a strange, distorted form of memory. It was an entity, driven by a consciousness that had been violently divorced from its canine origin. They stopped at a stream crossing, the water cold and clear, but lacking the usual minnows and aquatic life. They drank quickly, the silence of the woods amplifying the sound of their swallowing until it sounded like a heavy drumbeat. Then, they heard the sound they had been dreading, but not the sound they expected. It wasn't a howl or a moan or a roar of challenge. It was a low, monotonous scraping, a sound like heavy, rough-hewn stones being ground slowly against each other. Wretch scrape. Wretch scrape. It was rhythmic and immense, the sound of something large and terribly heavy that was not moving, but simply waiting. They moved toward the sound with a terrible, slow certainty, pushing through a dense screen of fir branches until they emerged into a massive, hidden clearing. The clearing was vast, perhaps 3 acres in size, but entirely enclosed by the towering canopy. The ground was not dirt, but a disturbing patchwork of white. The field was littered with bones, bleached white and stripped clean, mostly elk, deer, and smaller predator bones, meticulously scattered across the clearing. The air here was heavy, hot, and reeked of wet, powerful musk, fermentation, and the sticky animal odor of large, unwashed canine bodies. The scraping sound was gone. It ceased the moment they stepped into the open. Everything here was still. They had found the den. The clearing was dominated by a central feature, an agglomeration of roots, river stones, and large, decomposing branches that formed a rough, primitive altar. It was perhaps 7 feet high, shaped like a clumsy, brutal throne. It was unoccupied, but the atmosphere around it was saturated with a thick, almost visible sense of power, a residue of intense, volatile authority. Arranged in a wide semicircle, facing the throne, were 5 other figures. These were the subordinates. They were smaller than the creature Tom had encountered, leaner, their black and gray coats looking matted and damp. Their movements, when they shifted slightly, were nervous, jerky. They stood, rigidly bipedal, but their heads were bowed low, their enormous snouts tucked against their chests. They were motionless, completely, unnervingly still. Claire gripped Tom's arm, her fingers digging in through the heavy cloth of his coat. They're not moving. They're waiting. They're not sleeping, Tom. They're observing a schedule. This isn't just a pack, it's a garrison. She pointed to the creature closest to the right edge of the semicircle. It was twitching constantly, small, convulsive spasms running through its back and shoulders, as if the physical form was fighting an internal seizure. Tom realized that these 5 were the victims of the same transformation, forced by sheer, brute will to adopt this new, horrifying shape and hierarchy. They were not naturally occurring monsters. They were evolution dictated by a dominant external force. Tom felt a strange, cold conviction settle over him. He unzipped his pack and pulled out the old leather collar, Cotti's collar, worn soft and scarred from years of hard use. It was his desperate, final weapon. His aim was simple, to use the only thing that spoke to the dog beneath the demon. A plea to the sliver of affection and memory that Claire's survival had confirmed still existed within the Alpha. He took a deep breath, the foul air burning his lungs. The plan was insane, hinged entirely on a sentiment that had been surgically removed by the change. He took 1 step forward. The dry, white bones under his boot crunched with a deafening noise. 5 heads snapped up simultaneously. The eyes that stared back at Tom were flat, yellow, and dull. They held no warmth, no flicker of recognition, only the hungry emptiness of subservience. Yet they did not attack. They looked past Tom, toward the throne, awaiting the directive of their master. Then, from the impenetrable blackness of the trees directly behind the throne, where the shadows seemed deepest and most absolute, the leader emerged. Cotti. He was even larger than Tom remembered from their brief, terrifying encounter. He had grown in the intervening days, a truly monstrous edifice of muscle and black oiled fur. His head was held high, his powerful shoulders thrown back. His entire massive body vibrated with restrained energy. He stopped, standing at least 7 feet tall on his powerful hind legs, and surveyed the clearing. He tilted his head slightly, and then he let out a sound. It was not the sound of a beast demanding compliance. It was a harsh, agonizing vocalization, a cry that sounded like a question hurled at the uncaring sky. It was a challenge, not to Tom, but to the nature of his own existence. Cotti, the Alpha, covered the distance between the shadows and the center of the clearing with massive, measured strides. Each footfall was heavy, resonating through the compressed earth. Standing fully upright on his hind legs, he towered over Tom, easily 1.5 feet taller, a truly staggering display of power. His chest was thick, like an armored barrel, and the thick black fur on his shoulders bristled, static with aggression. Tom stood his ground, raising the old, worn leather collar into the stagnant, bone-scented air. "Cotti, to me. Drop," Tom said, his voice ringing with a startling clarity, cutting through the heavy silence. He spoke not to the monster, but to the dog who had slept on his porch for 9 years, relying on the sheer, stubborn power of unconditional companionship. He appealed to the core memory of obedience and love. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The towering creature froze, its amber eyes, now filled with that terrible controlled fire, darted frantically between the symbolic object in Tom's hand and the 5 silent, subservient bodies of the pack members. The collar represented the warmth, the safety, and the limitation of his old life. The pack represented pure, unrestrained power and the terrifying new reality. The creature's enormous snout twitched, and its lips pulled back involuntarily, revealing a shocking expanse of long, razor-sharp teeth. The entire massive frame shivered, a conflict tearing it apart from the inside. Just as the alpha appeared to be weakening, leaning infinitesimally toward the collar, another movement caught Tom's eye. From the same dense shadow where Cotti had emerged, another creature slunk out. This one was older, slower, and even larger in girth, though not quite as tall. Its fur was patchy, streaked with gray, and its body was a road map of scars. Old, white, ropey tissue crisscrossing its shoulders and flank. This was the one Cotti had destroyed or displaced, the previous alpha. The old alpha moved with a silent, predatory resentment. It saw Tom, the human with the object, and understood instantly. It was a weakness, a sentimental anchor dragging down the new leader. The old alpha let out a low, hissing noise, a sound filled with pure, unadulterated contempt. It ignored Cotti, focusing entirely on the smaller, easier target. The human was the key to reclaiming dominance. The creature launched itself at Tom. It was a blur of gray fur and muscle, driven by furious instinct. Tom instinctively raised the rifle, but he did not have the time to track the creature, much less pull the trigger. Cotti moved faster. The new alpha had shed its momentary doubt. With a soundless, explosive surge of power, it intercepted the old alpha mid-air. The two massive bodies slammed together, the sound echoing through the clearing like the impact of 2 wet concrete blocks. This was not a squabble over a kill. This was a duel for the throne, a clash between the raw, ancient desire for power and the strategic, brutal evolution imposed by the new regime. Tom was merely the catalyst, the living symbol of the vulnerability the old alpha sought to exploit. The combat between the two alphas was a horrifying spectacle, a pure, savage expression of primal command. The late afternoon sun broke through a gap in the canopy, splashing the center of the clearing with a sickly orange light, illuminating the swirling dust and blood spray. The old alpha fought with raw, brute instinct, relying on its massive weight and years of unchecked savagery. Cotti, however, exhibited a terrifying new kind of discipline. Despite his monstrous form, there was a surgical precision to his attacks, movements honed by some unnatural intelligence. He used his body not just for strength, but for leverage and calculated maneuvers. Tom watched with a horrified fascination, recognizing the familiar, fluid motion of a beloved pet in the midst of pure, devastating carnage. The grace of the domestic dog now applied to the physics of destruction. The old alpha, driven by desperation, managed to score a major blow. It caught Cotti on the flank, tearing a deep, gaping wound just above the hip. The hot, metallic scent of fresh blood immediately flooded the air. Cotti stumbled, his front legs buckling, the massive body falling heavily to one side. The old alpha moved in for the finishing attack, its jaws aimed for the throat. And then Cotti did the impossible. He did not roar. He did not snarl. He uttered a sound that tore through the primal scene with the shock of pure familiarity. A short, high-pitched, whiny yelp, the sound Cotti had always made when he wanted Tom to toss the tennis ball, the sound of playful demand. The old alpha hesitated. The sound, utterly alien and non-threatening in this context of battle, broke its predatory focus. That single, fatal instant of confusion was all Cotti needed. With a superhuman surge, Cotti lunged upward, rotating his entire body, locking his jaws onto the vulnerable spine of the old alpha's neck. There was a brief, terrible crunch, a sound like a heavy stick snapping under a boot. The fight stopped. The old alpha's huge body slumped, collapsing into the dirt and white bones. Its eyes, wide and dull, were instantly vacant, the life extinguished by a single, precise, non-negotiable movement. It ended its path. The 5 subordinate creatures, who had been watching the entire exchange with unwavering intensity, lowered their massive heads to the ground. They sank into a crouch, submitting to the victor. They had witnessed the judgment. They had accepted the strength of the new commander. Cotti, breathing in enormous, painful gasps, stood over the motionless body, his dark fur sticky with blood, his own and his rivals. He dragged his wounded flank slightly as he slowly turned his attention back to Tom. He did not growl. He did not advance. Instead, the monstrous creature approached his former master with the cautious humility of the once domestic dog. He lay down at Tom's feet, just as he had done hundreds of times by the hearth. He lowered his massive, powerful head, wet with viscera, and gently laid his snout across Tom's knee. The amber eyes, still burning with residual fear and power, turned up to meet Tom's gaze. There was a clear, unmistakable plea in them, a profound, silent request for release. Tom lowered his hand slowly, trembling slightly, and rested it on the stiff, coarse fur of the creature's head. He felt the heat radiating from the enormous body, the incredible tension in the muscles slowly beginning to slacken beneath his touch. The animalistic rage melted away under the familiar pressure of a human hand. Cotti looked at him one last time. In that final extended gaze, the fire in the amber eyes dimmed. Tom saw neither the beast nor the commanding alpha. He saw only the exhaustion, the pain, and the ultimate weary acceptance of his dog. Cotti did not convulse or struggle. He simply released a final, hot, gusting breath against Tom's knee. The vast weight of his head grew heavier on Tom's leg as the final spark of life left him. The metallic, chemical smell of the Dogman faded, replaced entirely by the familiar, comforting odor of earth, damp fur, and old pine. Cotti was gone. He was nothing but a heavy, silent mass of black muscle and bone. Tom felt the cold certainty that it was not merely his dog that had been destroyed, but the last fragile link to a life that had been predictable and sane. Claire approached the scene, her face pale, but her movements composed. She knelt beside Tom and gently placed her hand on the creature's massive forehead. He destroyed the original threat, Tom. He took down the creature that changed him, that forced this hierarchy, she said, her voice quiet. He didn't want you to become part of this existence, part of the pack. He chose to end his path so you could remain a man. Tom remained seated, holding the heavy head, the silence of the clearing now absolute and immense. He felt no surge of terror or overwhelming grief, but rather a slow, cold realization of an impossible burden. Cotti had not just ended his own suffering. He had passed on a responsibility. Tom looked up. He focused on the 5 surviving creatures of the pack who were still prone, their heads bowed low, awaiting direction. Tom rose stiffly, his limbs aching from the tension. The heavy rifle in his hand felt strangely light, irrelevant. He stood over the body of the fallen Alpha, over the defeated old Alpha, and looked at the 5 remaining Dogmen. He did not speak. He did not have to. He looked at them with a profound, terrifying stillness, projecting a command that had nothing to do with muscle or teeth, but with a horrifying, inherited authority. He had seen their leader's last moments. He held the scent of his passing. He had witnessed the transition of power. The 5 creatures slowly raised their heads. Their dull yellow eyes swept over the scene. The 2 defeated alphas, the human standing untouched in the center of the carnage. They sniffed the air, taking in the scent of blood, the fear that had evaporated, and the dominant scent of the living human who had held the vanquished leader. One by one, they rose. Their movements were cautious, subservient. Without looking back at the body of their former alpha, they turned toward the tree line. They moved silently, dissolving into the gathering shadows, retreating into the depths of the forest, accepting the new, impossible arrangement. They had accepted him. The transfer was complete. Claire and Tom walked out of the silent forest. They walked toward the road in silence. Claire occasionally tried to talk about their next move, about finding a way to safety. But Tom did not respond. He walked with his eyes fixed on the dark wood, and his gaze carried neither fear nor relief. They reached the outskirts of the nearest small town by mid-morning. Tom stopped the F-150. He handed Claire the remaining boxes of ammunition and all the cash he had left. "Go south," he instructed, his voice flat, emotionless. "Don't look back. Don't stop until you reach the desert." Claire gripped the money, her eyes full of confusion and rising panic. "Come with me, Tom. We can get help. We can tell people." Tom shook his head slowly. "Number. I can't go with you." He looked toward the mountains, the dark, brooding line of the forest where the creatures had retreated. He felt an intense, anchoring certainty that his place was no longer in the human world. He had inherited the perimeter. He was bound to the territory. He watched Claire drive away until her truck was just a speck of dust on the horizon. Then he turned around and drove back toward the house, back toward the Dogman territory. When the state police finally entered the area a week later, accompanied by wary search and rescue teams, they found the wreckage of the abandoned motel, the blocked highway, and the ransacked house. They located the deep clearing, finding the massive skeletal remains of 2 large, unfamiliar canid creatures, and the strange, bone-covered ground surrounding the stone altar. Tom Randall was officially declared a missing person. Over the next 2 weeks, an uneasy, unnatural tranquility settled over the area near Silver Creek. The relentless attacks ceased entirely. The local papers reported a peculiar anomaly. The population of coyotes, wolves, and mountain lions in the deep forest areas had dropped drastically. The territory was being efficiently and brutally cleaned. One elderly deer hunter, known for his stubborn refusal to abandon his family cabin miles from any road, returned to the junction deeply shaken and incoherent. He described seeing an enormous bipedal figure standing motionless atop an exposed granite bluff, looking out over the valley. The figure was clad in a familiar, heavy, worn jacket, the same one Tom Randall wore. The hunter swore he saw the figure holding something in its hand, something small and dark, a piece of old leather. He further recounted that seated below the figure, clustered around the base of the rock, were 5 black, silent creatures waiting. They watched him, their eyes like pale, yellow coals, but they did not move. They waited until he had backed slowly, cautiously, outside the invisible line of the bluff's influence before they allowed him to flee. Tom Randall, the grieving, rational farmer who had only sought a logical explanation for the terror invading his life, was now fully integrated into the nightmare. He had embraced the terrible duty. He was the sentinel of the woods, the inherited alpha of the new hierarchy. His face, weathered by the cold Montana wind, was set in a mask of heavy purpose, and his eyes, fixed on the mist-shrouded horizon, now carried the heavy, unwavering amber gaze of the protector. History 2. Aaron Blake always measured the world in quantifiable metrics: pounds per square inch, tensile strength, degrees of pitch, and the exact mileage between one catastrophe and the next. As a road service evaluator, he dealt not in guesswork, but in the cold, hard reality of asphalt and fracture. Today's job started routinely. Despite the remote location deep in the forest near the Montana-Idaho boundary, a standard inspection of a recent landslide that had chewed up a few hundred feet of county road. He drove his sturdy, khaki-colored government pickup 30 miles past the last sign of civilization. The air grew colder and denser with every yard gained in elevation. When he finally stopped, the silence was immediate and absolute, a tangible physical weight pressing down on his eardrums. It was the dead quiet of a place where sound went to retire and never returned. The air held a sickly mineral bouquet, the sharp tang of bruised spruce needles, the dank scent of long, stagnant runoff, and a metallic coppery hint, like old pennies or dried blood. The temperature registered 45 degrees Fahrenheit, but the chill penetrated deeper than the reading indicated, sinking directly into his bones. He parked on the edge of the damage zone. The road was indeed broken, an ugly, jagged scar across the mountain's flank. Aaron put on his safety vest, grabbed his clipboard and laser measure, and started his work. Routine was his anchor. He clocked the shear line, measured the lateral shift of the subgrade, and meticulously noted the unusual crystalline structure of the exposed rock face. The paperwork felt good in his hands, a shield of bureaucracy against the intimidating vastness of the woods. But as he moved closer, the damage refused to fit the typical profile of a geologic slide. The asphalt was not just fissured, it was twisted, sections of pavement corkscrewed outward like strands of taffy pulled too hard. The exposed boulders were not merely scraped. Their edges were unnaturally smooth, almost polished, and in places, melted. The earth had not slid under the influence of gravity. A massive, concentrated force had violently ripped it open. Aaron dismissed the unsettling image. He settled instead on the concept of flash flooding, combined with unusual mineral pressure and rock decomposition. There was always a technical explanation. The sun, which had been fighting a losing battle with the heavy, low-slung clouds all morning, gave up entirely. The light did not just fade. It turned instantly to a dull, unsettling shade of ash gray. Aaron felt the acoustic dampening effect intensify. When he walked across the gravel berm, his boots made a crunching sound that traveled only inches before being swallowed whole by the dense timber line. He had not heard a single bird or insect since he arrived. His work ledger indicated the nearest Forest Service cabin was only a half-mile further up the decommissioned road, a good place to shelter and complete his final documentation. He locked the truck, grabbing his heavy pack and the company-issued flashlight, a large, clumsy, high-powered flashlight. The walk was difficult. The woods here were claustrophobic, the pine needles creating a soft, soundless carpet underfoot. As he approached the cabin, an even stranger detail emerged. The thick lower branches of the ponderosa pines bordering the clearing had been stripped. The wood fibers were split along the grain, leaving long, pale, splintered trails 2 yards above the ground. It looked as though something enormous had run its claws down the trees, peeling the bark and low limbs away. He reached the cabin, a small, sagging structure of rough-hewn logs. The paint was bleached, the windows opaque with dust and condensation. He found the lockbox keyed to his government identification, a small relief. Inside, the air was thick, smelling of decades of damp spruce, mouse droppings, and the lingering residue of stale kerosene. There was no power, naturally. He set his pack down, his gaze drawn to the radio mounted on a dusty shelf. A heavy, old shortwave unit. On a whim, he flicked the power switch. The unit hummed to life, filling the suffocating silence with a brittle, high-pitched shriek. It was not static. It was a pure, digital-sounding interference, a piercing, grating sound that contained, buried deep beneath the electronic racket, a raw, tormented cry. It was the sound of agony put through a high-frequency filter. Aaron yanked the volume knob back down, plunging the cabin back into absolute silence. The silence felt worse now. He retrieved a can of beef stew from his provisions bag, but the thought of eating made his stomach clench. He was a rational man, accustomed to isolation, but this was different. This felt like surveillance. He peered out the window. The heavy mist that characterized the day had now solidified. It did not roll or cling to the ground like normal fog. It stood, a vertical wall of dense, blinding white pressed in on the perimeter of the small clearing. It was not weather. It was a barricade. It looked like the end of the world, 30 feet from the cabin door. Aaron closed the shutters and bolted the door. His breath came shallowly. He told himself it was the altitude. It was not the altitude. It was the creeping, undeniable certainty that the world he knew, the world of measurable fact and bureaucratic order, had ended just outside that glass pane, and he was now trapped in something else entirely. Something ancient and hungry. He checked his watch. 4:30 post-meridian. The long night was just beginning. He needed light, and he needed a way to hold on to his sanity. The old kerosene lamp on the mantelpiece was a fussy, stubborn thing. It took Aaron 3 tries and half a box of matches to coax a stable flame from the wick. When it finally caught, it cast a sickly, jaundiced glow over the main room. The light, far from being comforting, only carved out predatory spaces in the darkness. The corners of the room were not just dark. They were active, occupied by shadows that shifted and crouched just beyond the radius of the yellow light. He sat down at a small, scarred wooden desk. The air was heavy and still, the heat from the lamp doing little to counter the bone-deep chill. He tried the radio again, turning the dial slowly, hoping to catch even the faintest whisper of a human voice, a weather report. Anything that proved civilization still existed a few miles away. Nothing but that high, searing shriek like static tearing itself apart. He switched it off with a decisive click. The desk contained 3 shallow drawers. In the bottom one, under a stack of brittle, fly-specked maps, he found a small, leather-bound journal. Its pages were yellowed and smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke. It was a logbook dating back 20 years, containing meticulous board entries about snowpack, firewood rotation, and radio checks. Aaron skimmed the early pages, noting the neat professional hand. But as the dates neared a decade prior, the writing changed. The script grew erratic, rushed, almost clawed into the paper. The rational notes gave way to observation, mixed with raw, unedited terror. He read the last continuous entry aloud, his voice low and unsteady in the heavy silence. Relative atmospheric humidity 72%. Winds low. Smell strong again tonight, sulfur and wet dog, they are waiting. If you hear the call, do not respond, do not look up. The entry on the subsequent page was even shorter, scrawled sideways, vibrating with panic. Do not go out after the 3rd signal. Do not look up. The sound is not what you hear, it is what hears you. The writing ended there, abruptly, mid-sentence, the pen having dragged off the page in a frantic stroke. The date below it was August 14th, 10 years ago. Aaron, the man of facts, fought the instinctive scoff of dismissal that rose in his throat. Some lonely ranger's attempt at creative writing, he thought. A childish specter story to stave off isolation. He smoothed the page, closed the book, and placed it back in the drawer. As the wood of the drawer slid shut with a soft thud, a noise answered from outside. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of a floorboard creaking. Not the wind shifting the building's weight, but the stressed key-ick of old wood bearing sudden heavy pressure. The noise came from the front porch, 5 feet outside the window, exactly where he had just stood. Aaron froze, every muscle fiber tightening. He knew that sound. It was the dry rot in the deck planking right next to the railing. He strained his ears. Silence. Absolute, oppressive silence, as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting for him to move. Then, the window glass began to vibrate. It was not a rattling vibration caused by wind. This was a deep, resonant tremor, vibrating the entire foundation of the cabin. A low-frequency shudder transmitted through the wet earth. It felt less like a shock wave and more like the rhythmic pulse of something vast and heavy moving right alongside the exterior wall. Broom. Broom. Aaron pressed his back against the solid log wall, fighting the urge to breathe. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, wet rhythm. This was no prank. This was no geology. This was movement, something massive, low to the ground, scraping or perhaps even digging near the foundation. The sound intensified, shifting into a guttural, uneven rumble, a low, throaty purr or a painful gasp, cut short by the effort of breathing. It was heavy, wet, and undeniably biological. He slid his gaze toward the window. Dread locked his neck muscles. He didn't want to see it, but the compulsion was a physical pull. The dirty window glass served as a terrible, distorting mirror, reflecting the soft yellow smear of the lamp and the anxious outline of his own face. Then, in the very periphery of that reflection, something dark and quick whipped past the window frame. It was a fast, lateral motion, low to the ground, blurring the line between shadow and substance. It was gone in less than a second, but Aaron's animal brain registered the impossible speed and the sheer bulk of the movement. A chill like liquid nitrogen poured down his spine. No man could move that fast, stay that low, and generate that much ground tremor. He stayed pressed to the wall, counting his breaths, trying to cycle air into lungs that felt full of concrete dust. The rumbling outside continued, retreating slowly, becoming fainter, moving into the deeper woods. He kept picturing the blurred shape, too big for a coyote, too low for a deer, too fast for a bear. He sat there for 3 hours, not daring to move, while the kerosene lamp slowly burned down, eating the precious fuel. When the oil finally gave out, the cabin plunged into the deep, suffocating blackness of the mountain night. Aaron realized that the silence was not protective. The silence was the absence of anything that could challenge the absolute reign of the thing outside. He spent the rest of the night curled on the floor, the high-powered flashlight clutched in his hand, a pointless aluminum club against whatever massive, suffering thing was breathing just beyond the edge of the clearing. He remembered the journal. The sound is not what you hear. It is what hears you. He knew, with cold certainty, that it had heard his heart beating. It knew he was here. The dawn arrived not with a welcoming flash of light, but as a miserable dilution of the night's blackness. The air was a heavy, cold sponge, and the temperature had dropped close to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Aaron waited until the spectral ash-gray light of early morning penetrated the gaps in the window shutters before he finally uncurled his stiff, aching body. His rationality had returned, but it was bruised and sickly. He had to inspect the grounds. He could not just sit here and let the forest chew on his sanity. He unbolted the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch. The air immediately assaulted him with a fresh wave of scent. The usual forest aromas of pine and damp earth were violently overlaid by something rank and metallic, the smell of wet, decaying fir and sharp ammonia. It was a wild, powerful odor, clinging to the wood like spilled paint. He descended the 3 wooden steps, his heavy boots sinking slightly into the soft, rain-dampened soil. He kept his eyes fixed on the ground, tracing the perimeter of the foundation. And there they were. Just 5 feet from the porch, where the heavy vibration had emanated from, were the impressions. Not smears, but distinct, powerfully imprinted tracks in the packed earth and moss. They were enormous. Aaron placed his own size 12 boot next to one print. The track was easily 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide. They were plantigrade, meaning the heel and the entire foot rested on the ground, indicating a bipedal stance, like a human's. But the details were horrifically wrong. 5 massive, wide toes ended in thick, deep gouges, claws that looked less like talons and more like blunt, sharpened wedges driven into the soil. The stride was long, powerful, and uneven, confirming his memory of the creature's labored, heavy breathing. Aaron stared, his mind wrestling with this undeniable evidence. This was not a large bear. This was not a wolf on its hind legs. This was something built for vertical, devastating locomotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his company phone, a tough, waterproof slab of plastic and metal. He had to document this. Evidence was the only currency he had left in the human world. He crouched down, forcing his shaking hands to be steady, and took 3 pictures of the tracks from different angles, using the flash to highlight the depth of the impressions. He stood up, wiping the cold spray of moisture from his face. He quickly navigated to his contact list, selecting the number of his supervisor, a man named George who would require documentation to believe any of this. Aaron hit send on the text message. The phone immediately chimed, not with a standard delivery receipt, but with a system error notification. No network. He expected that. But then the phone screen flashed a strange, internal message. Storage access violation. System clean initiated. A wave of icy alarm washed over him. He opened his photo gallery. It was empty. All his recent work photos, the pictures of the landslide, and the 3 crucial images of the tracks, the whole kit and caboodle, were gone, vanished, erased by remote command. Aaron gripped the phone, staring at the blank screen. The vulnerability hit him harder than the tracks themselves. This was not a natural horror, a blind beast stumbling through the woods. This was intelligent. Something was actively managing the information flow in this valley. It was deleting facts. His rational duty dissolved entirely. He had to get out. He walked quickly back to the pickup, his stride now rushed, crossing the 100 yards of ruined road. He swung open the truck door, already planning the 30-mile drive back to civilization. But when he looked down the road, his stomach dropped into a sickening void. The road was blocked. Not by the initial rock slide, but by a fresh, clean obstruction 300 feet ahead. A thick line of 7 mature lodgepole pines, each at least 2 feet in diameter, had been sliced through. They lay stacked like freshly cut pencils, their tops perfectly uniform. It was an impossible geometry. The trees were not uprooted by wind or felled by an ordinary chainsaw. They were shorn, cut by something with immense power and a blade of impossible sharpness. Scattered among the splintered trunks were twisted, unrecognizable pieces of guardrail and road signs, metal snarled into ugly knots. His escape route by truck was utterly eliminated. He looked at the dense, suffocating wall of the bitterroot forest. The only way out was to ditch the vehicle and hike the 5 miles west to the old, derelict logging trail, a route barely marked on his maps, but one that might offer a path out of this suffocating valley. He opened the truck bed, retrieved his heavy backpack, a liter of water, a roll of duct tape, and the largest, heaviest wrench he owned, 1.5 feet of cold, solid steel. It was a miserable weapon, but it was all he had. Aaron stood on the broken pavement, looking back toward the cabin and the invisible tracks. He made a vow to himself, a silent, hard commitment. I will not survive the night, but whatever is here will know I was here. He turned west, stepping off the relative security of the road and plunging into the wet, dark heart of the timber. The first half hour of the trek was a physical ordeal, a brutal contest against the environment. The terrain was steep and uneven. The ground often gave way beneath his weight, forcing him to grab at slick, moss-covered rocks and snapping branches. The forest here was actively hostile, tangling his path with thorny undergrowth and the silent, judging presence of millennia-old trees. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of claustrophobia. In the city, he knew where the walls were. Here, the walls were endless, dark, and shifting. Every pine looked identical, every thicket a trap. His sense of direction, usually infallible, began to fray under the pressure of pervasive dread. Then a new smell cut through the heavy perfume of pine and damp earth. It was weak at first, then rapidly grew stronger as he moved downhill toward a trickling creek bed. It was metallic, sour, and sickeningly sweet. The rank smell of drying, oxidized blood and ancient spoiled meat. He clambered over a fallen log and stopped dead. He had stumbled upon the remnants of a campsite. It had been abandoned recently, perhaps only weeks ago. A stone fire ring, a blackened coffee pot, and several crumpled aluminum beer cans lay scattered on the ground. But the scene was not one of simple abandonment. The 2 small nylon tents were pulverized. The bright orange synthetic material had been shredded into ribbons, the rips clean and violent, as if cut by industrial shears or enormous claws. The poles were bent and snapped mid-span, exhibiting incredible force. Aaron approached the center of the clearing, his heart beating a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. Near the fire ring, the ground was soaked with a dark, crusty patch. The soil itself was stained black. It was too large for an injury, too voluminous for anything less than a catastrophic hemorrhage. It had dried in the sun and rain, forming a slick, dark glaze. This was not a warning. This was an aftermath. He scanned the immediate area. No bodies, no obvious remains, which made the scene even more frightening. Whatever had happened here, the cleanup had been efficient. Near the base of a birch tree, half hidden by ferns, lay a discarded pack, a rugged internal frame hunting backpack, camouflage green. He hesitated, then knelt, checking for traps, fighting the primal urge to flee. He had to know. He opened the main compartment. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, were dry socks, a map, a water filter, and a survival knife. At the very bottom, tucked under a wool blanket, was a small, heavy object. A camera. Not a smartphone, but an old-school, compact 35mm film camera. It was cold, damp, but undamaged. A strange, desperate curiosity overtook the fear. In this landscape where digital evidence was instantly erased, where reality was being willfully deleted, a physical artifact, a piece of old technology, felt like a lifeline. He felt like an archaeologist digging through the ruins of a Pompeii moment, a life interrupted mid-breath. He checked the exposure counter. It read 35. The camera was full. The last image had just been taken. As Aaron clutched the camera, the weather shifted again. The sky opened up, releasing a fine, needle-sharp drizzle. It was 42 degrees, and the cold, wet reality of the woods seeped into his clothes, turning his denim jacket into a second, icy skin. He felt exposed, suddenly and utterly vulnerable. The sound of the rain hitting the needles was not a natural sound. It was a distraction, a curtain drawn across the stage. He realized the hairs on the back of his neck were standing up. He felt the unmistakable, agonizing certainty of being watched. He did not see movement or hear footsteps, the rain ensured that, but he felt the weight of an unseen gaze. It was a cold, deliberate attention, focused squarely on the back of his head, cataloging his movements, waiting for his next mistake. The presence felt close, too close. Maybe 30 yards away, nestled in the shadows of the pines, blending with the vertical gloom. Aaron slowly zipped up the backpack, tucking the old camera deep inside his own rucksack for protection. He could not develop the film here, but he could carry the proof. That small canister of silver halide and cellulose felt more valuable than all the money in his bank account. He rose slowly, avoiding any sudden movements that might trigger the watcher. He had to get moving, to break the line of sight, to lose the scent. But the fear had turned viscous, clinging to his every step. He was prey now, walking slowly away from the kill site, carrying the single damning piece of evidence that linked the killer to the crime. Aaron pushed onward, ignoring the pain in his ankle and the relentless chill of the freezing drizzle. He moved away from the camp, trying to force distance between himself and the palpable weight of the observer. After an hour of brutal hiking, he spotted a natural overhang, a massive slab-like piece of granite that jutted out from the hillside, offering marginal protection from the rain. He slid under the rock shelter, pulling his pack off and resting the damp steel wrench beside him. His hands were numb, clumsy with cold, but he had to look at that film. He could not wait until he was safe, because he was no longer certain security existed. He wrestled the back panel off the old camera, careful to keep the film from direct exposure to the already dim light. He removed the cartridge and, using the flashlight shielded beneath his jacket, carefully pulled a length of the developed film from the spool. He held the thin, curled negative strip up to the filtered light of the afternoon sky. The images were small, dark rectangles of reversed color. He skimmed past blurry campsite pictures, memories of happier times. Then, the images changed. They became chaotic, violently shifted. He reached the final frame. The film felt cold and brittle in his fingers. It was undeniably blurry, shaky, a record of abject panic. The image was dominated by a blinding stark white flash, the bulb going off directly in the face of whatever the photographer had been running from. But in the center of the flash, the figure was unmistakable. It stood upright, impossibly tall, its shoulders sloping forward. The head was large, elongated, coated in dense, wet-looking fur. The musculature of the arms suggested a terrible crushing strength. It was undeniably bipedal, a creature that had evolved past any terrestrial mammal known to science. The fear was abstract until he focused on the details the flash had captured in a terrible, eternal moment. The eyes. The photograph showed two massive, reflective surfaces. They were not green or yellow, nor did they possess the white sclera of a human or the red lens flare of a night predator. They were pools of absolute, utter blackness, reflecting the burst of light back as if the internal workings of the creature were made of polished obsidian. They seemed to actively absorb light, drawing it into a vacuum. Aaron felt the contents of his stomach seize. This was it. Not lore, not speculation, not local tall tale. This was celluloid proof, physical reality. This thing was flesh and blood, bone and sinew, and it was inhabiting the same physical space as him. It had destroyed the people who owned this camera. His reality shattered. He now operated entirely within a horror movie, except the gore was real, the cold was real, and the breath catching in his throat was terrifyingly real. In that precise moment, as his mind finally registered the depth of his isolation and the certainty of his fate, the silence of the woods broke again. It was the howl, not the clean, musical lament of a timber wolf calling across a ridge. This was something different, something profoundly disturbing. It began as a low, rumbling intake of breath, building immediately to a colossal, ripping sound that tore through the air like a siren through paper. It held a pitch of agonizing sadness, a tortured, human-like melody stretched out and distorted by a monstrous throat. It was a scream of deep, inconsolable pain, a sound that transcended aggression and spoke only of suffering. The howl seemed to physically slap the rock face above him. Aaron instinctively clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound vibrated through his bones, through the granite he leaned against. The source was close. Maybe 200 yards upwind, traveling fast along the creek bed. Then, just as suddenly, the howling stopped. It cut off mid-cry, replaced by a sound that made Aaron's blood run colder than the wet air. A series of crashing, snapping sounds as something heavy moved violently through the underbrush directly toward the overhang. It was not hunting him by stealth. It had found the camera bag, or maybe his tracks, and now it was closing the distance with brutal, careless speed. The sounds were irregular, punctuated by heavy guttural puffs of air, the breathing of an enraged or desperate animal. Aaron scrambled to his feet, tucking the film strip into his shirt pocket. He assumed the creature ran faster than he could, even if it was wounded. He had to use the terrain. He abandoned the shelter, plunging downhill again, ignoring the tearing pain in his muscles. He ran toward the rushing sound of a bigger stream, hoping the noise of the water might drown out his own frantic movements, hoping the wet current might confuse the creature's scent. He ran until his lungs felt filled with crushed ice, desperately trying to put distance between himself and that sound. That horrific humanized cry that meant the final confrontation was minutes, not hours, away. Aaron followed the main stream, wading directly in the frigid, churning water when the banks became too tangled, trusting the noise and the cold current to mask his escape. After nearly 20 minutes, he finally slipped out of the water, soaked and hypothermic, and sprinted behind a cluster of massive, moss-covered cedars. He found himself looking out over a small, uneven meadow, about the size of 2 football fields. He stopped, struggling to control the wheezing in his chest, pulling oxygen into his burning lungs. He was exhausted, but the adrenaline held his frayed nerves together. And then he saw it. It stood near the far edge of the clearing, not searching, but simply standing still, utterly colossal in the fading gray light. The creature was easily 7 feet tall, its mass incredible, a dense, dark bulk of muscle and matted fur. The color was a deep, oil-slicked black, catching the minimal light on its broad, sloping shoulders. It was hunched slightly, its heavy, elongated head hanging low. Aaron realized he was staring at a myth-made flesh. The cold logic of the predator-prey relationship should have sent him running, but something held him there, hidden by the trunk of the cedar. He noticed the limp. The creature shifted its weight, and the action was visibly painful. It favored its left leg. As it turned slightly, Aaron saw the injury clearly. The right upper thigh was crudely wrapped in what looked like a tattered piece of grayish cloth. The wrapping was soaked dark, and where it pulled away, Aaron could see thick, blackish-red fluid weeping sluggishly into the surrounding fur. It was not a perfect, invincible machine. It was hurt. Badly. In that sliver of vulnerability, Aaron felt the first flicker of something other than pure, paralyzing terror. It was not courage, but a deep, perplexing surge of pity. This thing was suffering. The alpha predator raised its head. Even from this distance, the dark, flat gaze pierced the curtain of cedars. Aaron knew he was seen. The creature did not move toward him, did not roar. It simply waited, its heavy breathing audible even over the sound of the stream, a ragged, snorting intake of air. An uncontrollable, idiotic impulse seized Aaron. He was trained to survive, to keep moving, to deny the hunter its chance. But instead, he reached into his pack and retrieved his emergency rations, a strip of dried, heavily seasoned beef jerky. It was his last protein. He tossed the jerky strip out onto the damp earth, about 20 feet from his hiding place. It landed with a soft, dull thud. The creature watched the meat for a long moment, then slowly, deliberately, it lowered its massive body. It took a single, halting step toward the offering. The movement was slow, measured, and agonizing. When it reached the jerky, it did not rip at the food with its jaws like a wild animal. Instead, it bent lower and used one of its massive, clawed hands to delicately pick the strip up from the dirt. That moment, the moment the creature handled the food, was worse than the howl. The hand was grotesque, the fingers thick and ending in the blunt, terrifying claws he had seen imprinted in the soil. But the action was human. The way it held the jerky, the slight turn of the wrist. It resembled a man picking up a small, fragile tool. The creature raised the food to its face, tore off a piece, and began to chew, its great black eyes fixed on Aaron's position. There was no rage, only a profound, exhausted hunger. Aaron suddenly understood the journal entry. This was not merely a monster of the wilderness. This was something trapped, something that once possessed a rational mind. It was a person, twisted by some horrible biological curse, still retaining the faintest muscle memory of human action. He stayed perfectly still, his muscles cramping from the cold. The rain had slowed to a mist. The creature finished the jerky, then slowly, painfully, turned and lumbered toward the deeper darkness of the woods, disappearing behind a wall of ancient hemlock. Aaron remained hidden for another 20 minutes, shaking not just from the cold, but from the terrifying realization that his hunter was not a force of nature, but a tragedy. And tragedy often possessed memory. He had shown mercy, a dangerous, potentially fatal gesture. He had made contact. He knew he could not stay on the ground. He needed elevation, security, and time to process the chilling duality of what he had just witnessed. His map showed an old fire watch station approximately 1.5 miles north. It was a gamble, but he needed to see the whole valley, not just the next 10 feet of mud. He moved out of the cedar stand, his focus no longer solely on survival, but on understanding the nature of the curse that had created a weeping predator with a human touch. The hike to the fire tower was the hardest leg of the journey yet. It was all uphill, through increasingly steep, unforgiving terrain. The metal skeleton of the tower finally materialized through the misty gloom, a spindly, 100-foot-tall structure that seemed perilously frail against the backdrop of the massive mountains. Aaron reached the base, his breath sawing in his throat. The door to the landing platform was rusted open. The climb was nerve-wracking. The old steel steps groaned and protested under his weight, echoing loudly in the stillness, sending flocks of blackbirds scattering into the gray sky. He fought the urge to rush, trusting the height to offer safety, if only psychological safety. He reached the cabin at the top, a small glassed-in box perched above the entire valley. The view was panoramic, terrifying in its scope. He could see the dense vertical fog bank far below, marking the boundary of the isolated road he'd left behind. The cabin was bare but offered a welcome windbreak. The temperature outside was dropping into the mid-30s as twilight gave way to night. Aaron knew a fire was risky, but hypothermia was a certainty without one. He gathered a small handful of dry kindling he'd saved in his pack and, using a disposable lighter, started a meager, protected flame inside an old, overturned metal bucket. He sat close, letting the low heat leach the moisture from his clothes. For an hour, he simply watched. The moon began its slow ascent, casting a cold, blue-white light over the clearing far below, the location of the ruined hunting camp he'd visited earlier. He saw movement. The creature was back. It emerged from the tree line and lumbered slowly into the center of the camp clearing. It moved with slightly more ease now. The rest had helped. Or maybe the dried beef had given it a moment of strength. The monster approached the ancient, abandoned fire pit from the hunter's camp. It stood there, gazing down at the cold, ash-filled stone ring. Then, the creature did something that made Aaron gasp, the sound swallowed by the glass enclosure. It bent down, carefully separating a charred, partially burned log from the debris. It held the wood in its massive, clawed hand, its movements awkward yet intentional. It considered the placement, turning the log this way and that. Finally, with a clumsy human intention, it gently placed the piece of wood back into the ring, attempting to rebuild the fire. The creature, this thing of primal savagery, was trying to rekindle a fire. The memory of warmth, the technique of fuel stacking, it was all there, fighting against the terrible brute instincts that governed its new existence. Aaron felt a terrible, wrenching sympathy. This was not a beast that merely inhabited the woods. This was a ruined human being imprisoned within a biological nightmare, clinging to the last vestiges of civilization. A memory of sitting by a fire, of being safe and warm. His rational control snapped. The terror was replaced by a dangerous, overriding compulsion. He needed to understand. He needed to talk to it. He needed to know what horror had descended upon this valley 10 years ago, turning the rangers into monsters. He leaned forward, pressing his palm against the cold glass. He remembers, Aaron thought, his mental monologue screaming across the valley. He remembers how to be a man. He fought the desperate urge to shout, to descend the rattling stairs, to stand before the creature and ask, "Who are you? What did this to you?" He checked his watch. 10:45 post-meridian. The night was still long, but the cold was deepening rapidly. The wind picked up, rattling the tower structure. Aaron smothered his own small fire, dumping cold ash onto the embers. He could not risk the light being seen. He decided he would not risk the descent until the full light of morning. He would use the darkness to regain his equilibrium and reinforce his defenses. He needed to be a human, not a savior. He needed to survive. He pulled his jacket tightly around him, settling in for a long, anxious vigil, watching the dark, hulking shape sit patiently by the dead fire pit below. A lonely, wounded sentinel waiting for something it could not name. Just past midnight, the moon climbed high enough to cast sharp, unforgiving shadows across the clearing. Aaron was fighting a losing battle against exhaustion, the cold making his eyelids heavy and his limbs unresponsive. Then a new sound cut through the silence. A sound Aaron recognized instantly. A sound of the mundane world he had left behind. The crunch of heavy, synthetic-soled boots on wet gravel. He leaned over the wooden railing, peering down toward the edge of the clearing. Two figures emerged from the tree line. One was the creature. Massive, dark, and still slightly hunched. The other was a man. The second figure was dressed in the unmistakable dark green uniform of the Federal Forest Service. Heavy hiking boots, reinforced trousers, and a thick, zip-up jacket bearing the official patch on the shoulder. He looked like any other dedicated solitary employee working deep within the national forest. The man walked directly toward the creature. He did not approach with a gun drawn or with caution. He approached with the casual familiarity of a colleague. The man reached the monster, and the creature lowered its head further. The man reached up, his movements slow and tender, and whispered something into the massive, furry ear. The gesture was shockingly intimate, paternal, or perhaps fraternal. They were not hunter and hunted. They were associates. The whole reality of the situation fractured and reformed in Aaron's mind like broken glass reforming into a kaleidoscope of new, unspeakable horror. This was not a solitary beast, a rogue mutation. This was an infestation, an organization. People in authority, people meant to protect the land and the visitors, were part of the curse. Aaron instinctively moved away from the rail, pressing his back against the glass pane, his heart slamming against his ribs like a panicked fist. He tried to warn the man, even though every instinct screamed that the man was beyond help. "Hey!" Aaron shouted, his voice a cracked, dry whisper that barely carried beyond the tower cab. "Hey, you! Get away from it!" The man in the green jacket paused, his whisper ceasing instantly. Then, slowly, deliberately, the man turned his face upward, directly toward the fragile glass box 100 feet in the air. The bright moonlight caught his features. The light was cruel, stark, revealing the grotesque boundary line. The right side of the face was fully human, pale, taut with strain, the expression one of deep, abiding regret. The eye was normal, wide and fearful. But the left side, the whole left side from the temple down to the jawline, was covered in a thick, coarse coat of gray-black hair. The ear was elongated and pointed, and the left eye was a sickening milky white, opaque with cataract, half shuttered against the moonlight. The line where human skin met coarse fur was unnaturally sharp, a scar of transformation. The man-thing had heard him, and worst of all, he was not surprised. The creature beside him, the 7-foot monster, let out a low, satisfied snuff. The hybrid man looked up at Aaron. He did not strain or shade his eyes. He saw him perfectly. And then, in a voice that was low, clear, and utterly calm, he spoke Aaron's name, wrapping it in an ancient sadness. Aaron, the man in the uniform, sighed, disappointed by a child who had not listened to a simple instruction. "You shouldn't have stayed here so late. We told them the road was unsafe." The realization was a crushing blow. The road closures, the erased evidence, the profound silence. It was all a deliberate trap, a maintenance of the border. They had not just discovered him. They had been monitoring him since he arrived. The damage report was a scouting mission. Aaron Blake was not lost in the forest. He was surrounded by the enemy, and the enemy wore the uniform of the state. The man-thing tilted his head, the human eye glistening with pity, the furry eye fixed with absolute predatory resolve. "It's time, Aaron. Come down." The invitation to surrender was the final trigger for action. Aaron did not hesitate. Survival was a pure white instinct now, washing away all fear and compassion. He spun away from the window, grabbing the heavy steel wrench, his last connection to the world of tools and engineering, and bolted toward the ladder trap door. The structure immediately became his enemy. The The steel supports shrieked in protest as he slammed his weight onto the steps. He plunged down the 100 feet of exposed metal, skipping every other step, the momentum threatening to send him tumbling into the abyss of the darkness. He hit the damp earth at the base of the tower and didn't stop running. Behind him, the nightmare began its choreography. The man in the Forest Service uniform let out a sharp, echoing whistle, a sound utterly normal yet terrifying in context. The great creature responded with a sound that was no longer a lament, but a triumphant, blood-freezing roar of pure hunger. Rah! Aaron ran blindly, using the limited, uneven moonlight to guide his steps, dodging trees he couldn't see, trusting only the feel of the earth under his feet. He heard two distinct sounds of pursuit closing fast. The incredibly heavy rhythmic thump-thump of the full monster's gait, and the fast, unnerving shush-shush of the hybrid, who was clearly moving at impossible speed, his leather boots crunching on the pine needles like dry cereal. They were flanking him. He heard the hybrid's voice, now strained, slightly feral, calling his name from the left. "Aaron, stop this. It's better this way. You already know the truth." The monster roared from the right, the sound tearing into the fabric of the woods. He was running through a tunnel of blackness, his focus narrowed to the one goal: forward motion. He swung wide around a thicket of scrub oak, felt the ground drop out from under him, and plunged into an ice-cold ditch. The impact drove the air from his lungs. He was submerged in 3 feet of stagnant black water and sticky, foul-smelling silt. The metallic taste of fear, mixed with ditch water, filled his mouth. He thrashed wildly, trying to regain purchase. One of his heavy hiking boots stuck fast in the thick mud. He yanked his leg free, leaving the boot submerged, and scrambled out onto the opposite bank, using thick, wet roots for leverage. He was now running with one socked foot, the other booted, the uneven stride jarring his already exhausted frame. The pain was nothing. Survival was everything. He burst through a curtain of low-hanging cedar branches. The blackness was complete now. He was running purely on instinct, a terrified machine pumping blood and adrenaline. He felt the presence directly behind him, too close. He heard a sharp, wet sniff, followed by a low, anticipatory growl right at the base of his neck. A monstrous hand shot out and clamped onto his left ankle. The force was staggering. Aaron was slammed instantly to the ground. The creature did not attempt to bite or crush, but to hold and trip. The grip felt like a massive vice. Aaron screamed, a thin, strangled sound quickly drowned out by the monster's triumphant snarl. He thrashed, kicking wildly with his free leg. He felt the coarse fabric of his trousers rip instantly, followed by a burning, slicing pain as thick claws scraped deep into the flesh just above his ankle bone. The pain was searing, immediate, but it was the final jolt of adrenaline he needed. He gave one desperate, powerful surge forward, tearing his skin away from the grip. He felt the claws rake off his bone, leaving a burning, wet trail. He did not look back. He just scrambled forward, crawling, stumbling, pulling himself toward the only thing that felt solid and familiar: gravel. He burst through the final thicket of thorny bushes, collapsing onto a firm, flat surface. The asphalt was cold and hard beneath his bruised body, a rough black ribbon of civilization. He had reached the abandoned logging road. Behind him, the crashing stopped abruptly. The heavy, ragged breathing paused. The creature knew he was on the road. For some reason, the road was a boundary. Aaron lay there, tasting the grit of the shoulder, his body shaking uncontrollably, his left leg a slick mess of warm blood and cold mud. He was out of the deep woods. But he knew, with chilling certainty, that he was not out of their territory. Aaron lay on the center line of the abandoned logging trace, fighting the wave of blackness that threatened to pull him down into unconsciousness. His breathing came in high, ragged gasps. The blood loss from his ankle was significant, soaking the sock on his left foot and forming a slick stain on the asphalt. He risked a glance back at the tree line. Utter silence. The monster and the man in the uniform held their position, waiting for him to bleed out or pass out. They were respecting some invisible, terrifying jurisdiction. Then, through the ringing silence of the mountains, he heard it. A low, humming drone. A familiar, wonderful sound of internal combustion and friction. A vehicle. He began to crawl forward, using his elbows and dragging his wounded leg toward the distant sound. He had to be visible. He forced himself to sit up, lifting his head high, a desperate, broken scarecrow against the moonlight. The sound grew louder, resolving into the unmistakable noise of an aging 8-cylinder engine struggling with the mountain road. A minute later, a battered, slightly rust-colored state patrol pickup rounded the wide curve ahead. The single headlight beam caught Aaron, illuminating him in a blinding white glare. A muddy, bleeding wreck slumped on the pavement. The pickup slowed, its tires crunching on the coarse shoulder gravel, and came to a quiet stop a dozen feet away. The engine ticked down to a low idle. A man unfolded himself from the driver's side. He was clad in the dark brown uniform of the State Patrol, heavily built, with a tired face and deep, perpetual shadows under his eyes. He wore a tight, government-issue knit cap. Aaron felt an intense, irrational wave of relief. This was authority. This was sanctuary. "What in the hell happened here?" the patrolman asked. His voice was flat, professional, and entirely devoid of alarm. He did not rush. He simply stood there, hands resting on his belt, surveying the scene. Aaron tried to talk, but his voice was a ragged croak. Tracks. The cabin. They cut the road. A creature and the man. The one in the green uniform. It was hunting me. He tried to point toward the tree line, but his arm felt too heavy. He laid out the whole terrible story, the details of the half-human face, the immense size of the predator, the feeling of surveillance, the wiped phone, the shredded camp. He poured out the horror, the blood, and the raw, undigested truth. The patrolman listened patiently, his face unmoving. He looked not at Aaron's torn, bleeding leg, but past him, into the woods. When Aaron finished, collapsing back onto the cold asphalt, the patrolman simply nodded once. He walked around the truck, opened the passenger door, and then knelt beside Aaron. His movements were smooth, efficient, and unnervingly gentle. "Come on, son. Let's get you inside." The patrolman helped Aaron up, guiding his weight toward the truck cab. The warmth from the engine and the defroster felt like a physical embrace. Aaron slid onto the vinyl seat, the smell of old coffee and stale tobacco a bizarre comfort. The patrolman got back behind the wheel and put the truck into drive. They moved forward slowly away from the scene of the violence. "We need to get to a hospital," Aaron gasped, clutching his wound. The patrolman kept his eyes fixed on the empty road ahead. "No, we don't. We're going to the depot. You need to rest and fill out a report." Aaron blinked, confused. "A report? I was attacked. There are people who need help back there, or what's left of them." The patrolman gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Look, Blake, those woods are closed. They've been closed for years. You suffered a traumatic incident. You got turned around, fell down an embankment, cut yourself up badly. The extreme cold, the fatigue, it causes hallucinations." The calm, rational denial was the most chilling thing Aaron had experienced all night. It was worse than the sight of the claws. The patrolman was not dismissing him out of skepticism. He was dismissing him out of policy. "You didn't see anything," the patrolman continued, his tone patient, pedagogical. "There are no abandoned camps, no creatures, and certainly no people dressed in unauthorized uniforms. You were disoriented, hypothermic, and in shock." Aaron understood instantly. The rescue was a capture. This man was not a public servant. He was another part of the system, a bureaucratic extension of the terror in the woods. He had not been saved from the darkness. He had merely been transferred to the custody of the silence. The state patrol pickup traveled slowly, adhering exactly to the speed limit of 35 miles per hour, crawling down the desolate mountain highway. The heat in the cab was almost overwhelming, a deliberate attempt, Aaron suspected, to encourage drowsiness. The silence was profound. Aaron, shivering internally despite the heat, focused on the pain in his leg, forcing himself to stay alert. He knew if he allowed himself to fall into that deep, enveloping sleep, he would never wake up. The man beside him was waiting for him to drop his guard. "Where exactly are we going?" Aaron asked, his voice rough. "To the station," the patrolman replied, the lie smooth and practiced. "We need to log you in." Aaron knew the nearest station was at least 2 hours away. More than enough time for anything to happen. He had to send something out. He reached slowly into his jacket pocket, retrieving his phone. The screen was still displaying the system error from the network violation. He slid the phone under his thigh, trying to shield the weak blue glow from the patrolman's peripheral vision. He navigated the settings, turning on the wireless internet and radio transmission technology. Knowing the chances of hitting a signal were near zero, but hoping for some miraculous data burst to an orbiting satellite or a distant microwave tower. He also opened his cloud storage application, navigating to the folder he used for field documentation. He had to get the last evidence out, the tiny physical artifact of the old film from the hunter's camp, the picture of the absolute black eyes. He could not send the physical film, but he could describe the image. He needed a photograph, an undeniable piece of modern digital evidence of the current situation, something that tied the organization back to the creatures. Aaron slowly looked up, catching the patrolman's eyes in the rearview mirror. But the patrolman was not looking at Aaron. He was looking out the side window, staring intently at the dark, vertical wall of pines flashing past. His expression was concentrated, expectant. Aaron followed the patrolman's gaze, looking into the mirror, past the reflection of the truck cab, and into the blackness of the roadside woods. And there it was, pacing them, the great dark silhouette, moving with a silent, fluid grace that belied its massive bulk. The creature was keeping perfect pace with the 35 miles per hour speed limit, navigating the dense tree line as easily as water running downhill. But this time the creature was not naked and wounded. It was wearing a coat, a dark, rough garment that Aaron instantly recognized. The thing was wearing a dark green Forest Service jacket. The thick, square shoulders were covered in the synthetic fabric, and even in the low light, Aaron could make out the faint, lighter-colored insignia patch stitched onto the sleeve. The creature in the woods was wearing the uniform of the man who had pursued him. The man with the half-face. The police, the rangers, the monsters. They were all the same. They were integrated, co-workers in the eternal maintenance of the silence. Aaron lifted his phone, his hand steady for the first time all night. He pointed the camera lens directly at the rearview mirror. He needed to capture the whole scene. The thing in the uniform, the road, the faint internal reflection of the patrolman. Click. The flash was negligible, absorbed by the glass and the dark interior. Aaron quickly opened the photo and hit the Upload to Cloud button. The phone immediately indicated waiting for connection, but the file was now queued, attached to the exact global positioning system coordinates of the middle of this dark, lonely highway. He returned the phone to his lap just as the patrolman's head snapped toward him. The patrolman had not seen the flash, but he had felt the tension. The patrolman slammed his foot onto the brake pedal. The tires shrieked for a brief, terrible moment against the asphalt, throwing Aaron hard against the seatbelt. The truck shuddered to a halt. Silence descended once more, heavy and final. The patrolman did not move. He sat absolutely still, then slowly, deliberately, turned his head to look at Aaron. The exhaustion was gone from his eyes. There was only a cold, perfect awareness. When his face turned fully into the dome light, Aaron saw the change. The darkness he had seen in the creature's photograph, the absolute blackness that consumed the light. It was now reflected in the patrolman's pupils. No white, no reflection. Just two smooth, polished voids staring back at him. The patrolman reached out, not with a sudden violent strike, but with a slow, inescapable motion. The scent that filled the cab was the last thing Aaron Blake registered. A sudden, overwhelming blast of the sharp, metallic odor of wet metal and musky, soaked fur. It was the scent of the creature and the scent of the man, combined. Then came the cold, a sudden, searing physical plunge into absolute zero, shutting down his systems before the pain could even register. He did not survive the night. Several hours later, in the pre-dawn gloom, his body was discovered on the grassy shoulder of State Route 12B, approximately 40 miles from the last known government checkpoint. The discovery was made by an early morning logging crew. Aaron's wounds, the deep, savage gashes on his left ankle, were already cold, the blood crusting on the asphalt. However, the body was otherwise pristine. His clothes, though ripped where the creature's claws had dragged, were carefully smoothed, and he was laid out neatly, his hands folded across his chest. The patrol pickup was gone. There were no obvious footprints near the body, no indication of a struggle, only the dark, congealing blood and the lingering smell of ozone and wet earth. The ensuing investigation was quick and thorough. The official report, filed by the local sheriff's office and subsequently ratified by the state road services, concluded with chilling bureaucratic precision. Cause of demise: extreme hypothermia and cardiac arrest secondary to exposure. Circumstances: Aaron Blake, employee of the road service, became disoriented after an accident near a decommissioned county road. Suffering from trauma and rapidly setting frostbite, he began to hallucinate. He mistook natural elements and local wildlife for organized threats. He chose to end his path through exposure after climbing to the main highway in a state of extreme panic. The report noted his field pickup had been found undamaged near the purported slide site. its radio tuned to an unused frequency, but mentioned nothing of the impossible tree felling that blocked the road. The initial images of the strange tracks had been thoroughly erased from his government-issued devices. All the physical evidence of his traumatic night was reduced to the clinical findings of shock and cold. The official record achieved a perfect final silence. However, Aaron had made one last desperate final push. In the moment the patrolman slammed on the brakes, the sudden jolt had energized the phone's systems. The device, found lying on the shoulder 10 feet from the body, had managed, in that split-second pause, to connect to a weak, distant signal from a repeater miles away. The cued file, the last photograph taken in the mirror, was successfully uploaded to the cloud server, linked to the precise coordinates of the emergency stop. The image was blurry, taken in a rush, but it was coherent. It showed the dark reflection of the desolate highway behind the cab. In the woods, keeping pace with the truck, was the colossal, hunched creature. And in the very center of the frame, clearly visible in the reflected light, was the distinct government-issue patch on its shoulder, proving it wore the dark green jacket. In the foreground, dominating the frame, was the patrolman's face, turned halfway toward the lens, his eyes caught in the reflection. 2 points of pure, absolute blackness, absorbing the distant moonlight. The photograph remained suspended in the cold, digital ether, a truth ignored by the official record. Aaron Blake had been eliminated not by a feral beast, but by a coordinated, efficient, and lethal system. The Bitterroot Forest did not harbor monsters. It fostered a silent partnership, one where the protectors of the public roads were the very things they claimed to keep contained. The terror was not that the creatures existed, but that they held the keys to the kingdom. And in the mountains, they enforced the final deadly quiet.